And it's nice because, I feel like one of the common critiques you get as a critic when you're criticizing games is like, you try to do it better. And I'm here to prove that I can do it. I can deliver something good here.
This show is all about that exact hubris.
It's nothing if not an arrogant displaying of we could do it better.
Of us watching
with absolutely nothing at stake.
Yeah.
In 2017, Universal Studios announced the birth of a new shared universe of monster movies, bringing their classic horror icons into the contemporary franchise film landscape. But after the critical and financial failure of its first installment, the project was indefinitely abandoned. Now, in 2022, the powers that be have called upon one pulp horror devotee and one snarky film critic to unearth the concept. I'm Dylan Roth.
And I'm Dalton DeShane.
Are you afraid of the Dark Universe?
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Phase 2 of the Dark Universe. I am one half of your hosts, Dalton DeShane.
And I'm the other half of your hosts, Dylan Roth.
And we are back, not with a movie pitch this time, because, that's what we normally do on this show, is we are building the Dark Universe franchise of films, one film at a time.
Yes, if this is your first time, welcome to Are You Afraid of the Dark Universe? This is the show where we revive the aborted attempt at a Universal Monsters cinematic universe that began with the completely memory hole of a movie, 2017's The Mummy.
With Tom Cruise.
And we have, over the past 6 or 7 or 8 episodes, we have actually one by one pitched each other the following movies in that saga. We pitched a Wolfman movie, we pitched a Frankenstein movie, and so on, until we got to our Avengers-style crossover, The Dark Legion, House of Dracula. And that closed out our Phase 1. So now we're launching Phase 2, just as Marvel did with a bunch more solo movies building up to another crossover. But at the same time, because of the absolutely overwhelming success of Phase 1, obviously this is the podcast that everyone's been talking about. We are opening up the doors to all of the multitude of pitches we've been getting from the Hollywood elite who want to be part of this project, who want a piece of the pie.
We've got people banging down our door trying to get some money out of the Dark Universe. And you know what? We do have to share the love. We have to get other people. We can't do this all on our own, We're not experts in everything.
We really can't. And honestly, we should start spending some of this money.
Yeah, we've got too much of it. So today is not about the movies at all. We are going to start taking pitches from outside executives on a whole bunch of different things. That might be more movies. It might be television shows. It might be Funko Pops. We might do a whole episode, a whole 2-hour episode about the different Dark Universe Funko Pops and all the rare customizable versions.
I have to know which one of the 5 hair molds they put onto each of the characters, and if any of their eyes are different from the normal Funko Pop eyes. I'm looking here at, I think this is really where the money from the movie potentially made is this. I'm looking right now at a page for eBay for a Tom Cruise, The Mummy, Nick Morton Funko Pop mint in box that's available for sale for $1,199 or best offer.
And you know what? I don't like Funko Pops, but I need that fucking Funko Pop.
Well, Dalton, since the last episode,
Morton Funko Pop,
bought the fucking collector's edition 4K of the 2017 The Mummy and watched all of the bonus features.
We will talk about this on our Mummy Returns episode, but I bought the VR experience of The Mummy 2017, but the website they had to download the VR features doesn't exist anymore. So I spent a week going back and forth with Universal's support trying to get the VR special features before they finally just emailed me back and said that promotion has ended. And so I now have a Mummy branded VR headset that I can't watch that I cannot watch any Mummy VR content on because it doesn't exist. But anyway,
there was hardware involved that you had to purchase.
That's what it is it comes with a cardboard mummy that looks like you have Amenette's eyes anyway, we'll talk about that more in a later episode. But today, we're not, well, we actually will talk about VR a little bit, but we are here to talk about one of the major cash cows of any enormous franchise, which is the video game tie-in. And we have brought in an expert to pitch us the Dark Universe video game. He is 1/4 of the hosts of the excellent podcast Left Trigger, Right Trigger, as well as the gaming section lead at Digital Trends. You have probably seen him getting yelled at on Twitter for his very correct opinions about video games. Please welcome Giovanni Colantonio.
Thank you for having me. It's so nice to be here in the Dark Universe and to give you a correct opinion about how to make the first Dark Universe game. And it's nice because, I feel like one of the common critiques you get as a critic when you're, criticizing games is like, well, I bet you couldn't make one. You try to do it better. And I'm here to prove that me, with my years of experience, being way too, specific about games and really pulling them apart, that I can do it. I can deliver something good here.
This show is all about that exact hubris.
It's nothing if not an arrogant displaying of we could do it better.
Of us watching
with absolutely nothing at stake.
Yes, watching like a multi-million-dollar mummy movie that failed and being like, fuck you, we can do that.
Yeah, what does Tom Cruise know about making movies?
Yeah, so that is basically the premise of the show. I do have to ask, have you seen the 2017 Mummy film?
No, and I very specifically didn't want to before doing this. I thought about it, and I was like, I really want to live in the canon of this show's Dark Universe.
Thank you.
And despite the fact that the 2017 Mummy is real and not just like headcanon, in the context of this show, I wanted to keep it headcanon. So the way that you've described it is all that I know about it, which
And frankly, we have as many as like 200 listeners, which is more people than remember The Mummy 2017.
Yeah. And I don't think our listeners have watched it. We've had listeners reaching out being like, your podcast kind of makes me want to watch it. And we're like, you don't have to.
Okay, but Dalton, you just went online recently and live tweeted watching the movie and were surprisingly positive about it.
Yes, we'll talk about that also on our Mummy Returns episode, but I liked it. I like it more now, but I still think it's bad. But I understand why it's bad.
This is how Hollywood executives end up making a bad movie, is because they get really invested in the project and they can't see it.
That's the thing. That's why my Mummy Returns pitch is going to be terrible, because I'm going to start. I'm starting to get high on my own supply, and I'm going to pitch a god awful movie. But anyway, so we're here to talk about the Dark Universe video game.
Yeah.
Which felt like a good place to start our guest episodes, because movie tie-in video games go back to the very beginning of video game history. I mean, even going back to like the E.T. Atari game.
Wow, that's like, the one you picked to start with, huh?
That is, I mean, I'm sure there are other Atari movie, but that's like the most infamous one, right?
Yeah, certainly the most infamous, probably video game like IP adaptation of all time still.
Yeah, very few others are visible from space.
In a landfill. True. Yeah, exactly.
But I mean, even like when people of our generation were growing up in like PlayStation 1, Game Boy days, like every single major Hollywood movie had a video game tie-in on every platform. And like sometimes they were like different games. Like the Game Boy game would be an entirely different thing than like the PlayStation game, obviously, because the formats were different. But there would be something for everything. And that doesn't quite happen anymore.
Well, it not in the same way.
Not in the same way, yeah.
So I think licensed games are very interesting because depending on like what era you kind of came from as a gamer, those mean the word licensed is either like good or bad, right? If you have grown up like mostly in this PS4 era, like this new generation of consoles is where you started paying attention to it. Before this, maybe you were kind of like, I don't really game much, and now you're kind of serious about it. Licensed games are great. Because they are telling mostly original stories. They're taking IPs and they are doing stuff with them that are like more confident. You have like Marvel Spider-Man, which is a fantastic game. The Guardians of the Galaxy game is quite good. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Like all of these games are these big AAA games telling their own stories in the universe. And that is novel now, because before, I would say like the last decade, that is not what licensed games were. Licensed games, I mean, it used to be a bad thing. A licensed game for a movie used to essentially be the equivalent of like one of those novelizations for a movie you found in a grocery store where it's like Avatar, the book. And, it's
Shout
just
out
like...
Mike Duquette.
Was that a thing?
No, Mike has a if anyone doesn't know, Hollywood and Spine, he has a whole mailing list where every entry he reads a movie novelization and like reviews it, and he'll talk to the authors and stuff. Yeah, it's rare, very good.
An obvious pick if we ever did a novelization episode of this show, we'd have Mike on.
God, yeah. So I think like but it used to function like that, right? Like where I think you have some good novelizations, but a lot of the time, right, they're just kind of like, we retell the movie in book form. It's not necessarily a high quality thing. And that's what a lot of game like IP, that's how IPs were handled in games for a really long time.
Right.
You would get like Spider-Man the movie, the game, right? And like nobody really played it. It was just there. Even going back to the beginning of the Marvel like MCU universe, at the very beginning of it, during phase 1, like they were still doing games like this.
Yeah, Sega made games for Iron Man and Incredible Hulk, and nobody played them.
Nobody played those. There was actually a Captain America and a Thor game.
Really?
Nobody played. Yes,
I didn't even know about those.
Nobody played them, and like they weren't even reviewed. I mean, they were genuinely like just non-releases because at the time that was the reputation of licensed games, was like, this is shovelware. You know, this is stuff that like is made for cheap by studios. It's not taken seriously, and we're not really going to review it in the same way that we're going to review like God of War or something like that.
Well, and also like the timeline issue, like with both novelizations and video games, they have to basically start and end the development process like after the movie has gotten to a point where they know what it is and like what things are going to look like and what the story is. So like those are necessarily kind of rushed.
And with Marvel movies in the modern era, you would have to start making the game after the movie came out.
If you want to show it, and
they haven't designed the costumes until 3 days before release.
Yeah, so I think that's why you've seen this push in recent years away from like, oh, we're just going to do the movie as a game, and this push more towards like, we're going to use the IP to tell an original story in the universe, and, you know, like, potentially make it canon in the universe, you know? Like, I think the Star Wars Jedi games, like, might actually be canon now, which is really cool.
The Marvel games don't have to be because there's such a precedent for, like, multiverses and different versions of the character. And so there's no pressure to be like, this is in the MCU.
Exactly. So I think that's the shift that you've seen in recent years. I think like developers, it took them a long time to understand that like you don't need to do, you know, Eternals the game, you know, anymore, right? Like you can just make a game starring the Eternals, I guess, if you want to do that, and, you know, get the Kingo game going.
Kingo deserves a solo title.
I honestly could see it. That'd be great. Give Kingo a chance. Hashtag give everyone get on Twitter and tweet it. Dark Universe Pod.
Hashtag give Kingo a chance. And if enough of you do it, we will cast Kingo, not Kumail, but Kingo.
Character Kingo as
in
a
our
character.
next Dark Universe film.
I love that. That's great. But that's where we are now. Like that, the era that we're in now is actually kind of a golden age for IP games. I think it used to kind of be like, you know, that stuff was a dirty word, and actually the homegrown video game characters were the real stars. Kind of changing now, right? Like you look at Sony's strategy, and like they're really big on like utilizing IP and going into that. Like they kind of are using Insomniac, which is the studio that did Ratchet and Clank, kind of as just like a Marvel studio now. Like I think they're doing the Spider-Man games. I think they're the ones who are doing a Wolverine game next. That's their next project. So, you know, that's kind of where we're at.
But also I feel like the sort of parallel development with that, because we've got these IP games, which are all notably not tied to a specific movie. Like there's no like Age of Ultron game. There is an Avengers game, but it's not like tied to a specific movie. Like you said, they're all original stories. And I feel like the sort of other road that we've gone down is mobile games. Is like formats of video games that are actually built to be quickly developed, or like, you know, have the expectations aren't as high for them to be like, you know, 20-hour games or something. Like you can just kind of pick a format that already exists and make something less expensive, but also that doesn't need to be more than that.
Of course.
And, you know, you can make sort of smaller games to reflect specific movies, which kind of brings me to the next point I want to make. Listeners of the show may not know, there are Dark Universe games already. In fact, there are 3 of them. There were
incredible
3 tie-in games for The Mummy.
And that's wild considering the timeline we're talking about. 2017 is too late to do that.
It's very weird. I didn't even know about these until maybe we were halfway through our phase 1. I didn't know. I think it was when we talked about doing this episode, I like looked up, was there a Mummy tie-in game? And so there were actually 3. And one of them I think we can talk more in depth about because we played it. But the first one was a VR experience game that could only be played at AMC theaters in LA and New York.
Oh, that doesn't count. But yeah, sure.
It was a like, sort of like a hardware demo for some like VR headset that had like a wider like peripheral vision kind of thing. And it was basically a 10-minute experience where you are a Prodigium agent with a gun and you're like riding a helicopter and shooting mummies,
So it's just like a basic like on rails shooter.
It seemed like a rails shooter kind of thing. From what, people said that it was pretty well done and like a great, sort of VR experience demo kind of thing.
Yeah.
The other one was, this was actually wild to me. There was a mobile game called The Mummy Tales from the Dark Universe, which was developed by Night School Games, who did Oxenfree.
Wait, what?
And it is not on their website.
Whoa. Wait, seriously?
It doesn't exist anymore.
Oxenfree? Are you serious?
This is the year after Oxenfree came out.
All right, for the filthy casual among us, what is the context here for Oxenfree?
Oxenfree is like a very acclaimed indie narrative game. It is just kind of like about a bunch of kids on like an island. It's a little bit of a coming of age story, but it's like a vaguely horror story. But it's just kind of like one of those narrative games where you're walking around. It's dialogue choice driven. That's kind of the gameplay. It's a little spooky. It's eerie. Very, very acclaimed. And that company is like now owned by Netflix. Like Netflix like bought them to bolster their video game like lineup.
Are they like doing the Stranger Things shit now?
No, they're doing Oxenfree 2 right now. I mean, that's like their big project, but that was in development before it. So I think that's probably going to be like on Netflix as a and other consoles. And then I wouldn't be surprised if they move them to some like IP things at some point. But like a very acclaimed studio that is like super celebrated, and I guess did this game that nobody knows or played.
You can't get it anymore. And like I said, if you go to Night School's website, or their Wikipedia, like their like list of all the games they've made, this is not on there. It has been erased, but I have confirmed it is a Night School game.
Holy crap.
And it is actually a sequel to The Mummy. And this was wild to me, for canon reasons, because the Mummy ends with like Nick Morton and Chris Vale off to like find a cure for like Nick Morton being possessed by Set, and that's what the game's about. Like it establishes powers for Tom Cruise that are not in the film. He can apparently control creatures like scorpions and spiders. He can talk to the dead. Apparently, like he can talk to ghosts in like weird visions, and it's all about them finding the Book of Set in a tomb somewhere. And it is like it's a narrative game. I assume the person who wrote it, I can't remember his name, but he's the person who wrote Oxenfree. He's like their creative director.
Yeah,
I'm assuming he wrote it. He wrote the fucking hell out of this game. It is like so like novelistically written.
Is there like a playthrough that you got to watch? Or?
Yes, there are playthroughs on YouTube you can watch. I didn't get through all of it because it's really long, but I watched like the first 3 chapters or so. And the dialogue is interesting. It's actually more well written than The Mummy, the film. Although it is.
That makes sense.
It could use an editor, writers, but it's really good. The visuals though don't live up. It feels like the visuals were kind of slapped together. They're very static. There's not any like kind of emotion or interest in them, but the writing is interesting. The gameplay is very basic, just dialogue trees, and at some points you have to like scan the walls of a tomb to find like matching hieroglyphics. Just like very very basic gameplay. I'm gonna say for now it's not canon.
Okay, I was gonna ask, like, do you want to like make it like sort of B-level canon for our universe? That's inside your umbrella, the Mummy stuff.
I would have to watch it all again. There's nothing that's like explicitly like, oh, this completely contradicts what we've done. There's just stuff we would kind of have to justify retroactively that like I don't know if it's worth doing. Like he's like very sick in the game and he's getting sicker because of Set inside him, and like that's not what's happening when we meet Nick again in The Invisible Man. So we'd have to like kind of explain something that happened in the interim.
Sure.
I don't know.
You could also cannibalize it into your own shit if you want to.
We could. I'll probably have to finish watching the game, which I don't know if I want to do, but all
right. But there is a third game as well.
Yes. That is actually pretty good.
It's actually pretty good. Yeah.
It's called The Mummy Demastered. Do you want to talk about it a little bit? Because I know you played the whole thing. I played about maybe half of it.
Yeah, I played the whole thing. It's like a brisk 5-hour game. It's actually quite good. It is this game, The Mummy Demastered, and it is by the studio Way Forward, which, if you don't know Way Forward, they do a lot of kind of games, mostly in like a retro style. They are probably most well known for the Shantae games, which is like a very good action platformer kind of situation. They've done a couple of like, weird left field kind of like reimagining of much bigger IPs. Like they did a Blood Rain game at some point in 2021, which is fascinating. I didn't know this myself, but apparently they're also working on the Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp Collection, which is a remake of the Game Boy Advance Advance Wars series, which has been indefinitely delayed because it was supposed to launch very close to when the Russia-Ukraine situation happened.
Shit.
And Nintendo was like, we don't want to release a game called Advance Wars that has Russian characters in it right now. And it has been like indefinitely on the shelf for 2 years.
Wow.
So that's
I feel like I remember seeing that in a direct.
Yes, it was like 2 years ago.
Yeah, it was announced.
And it just has not come out. So this game is essentially a Metroidvania, which, if you don't know what that is, it's based off. It's very heavily inspired by Metroid. It is like an action adventure 2D game where you are gaining abilities and unlocking more of this map as you go.
If you played any of the original, like the remakes of like Metroid or Metroid 2 or even Metroid Dread.
Yes, same thing.
Or what was
Metroid Fusion, Metroid Zero Mission.
If you played any of those, not the Prime games, but like the like side scroller ones, that is what this game is basically.
Yeah,
exactly.
And the premise of it is that it's set in the universe of the Mummy, but you are actually playing as a Prodigium soldier, and you were kind of like hunting down the original Mummy, whatever that character is.
It really almost has nothing to do with the plot of the Mummy, because you don't really see the Prodigium agents very much in the movie, except for when they like capture Tom Cruise and get their asses handed to them by the Mummy at the end.
None of them have names. They're just there to get cut down, and we maintained that tradition throughout phase one.
But it's very funny that like for both the VR experience and this one, it's all about Prodigium, because that's like that's when you can give the character a gun and just like,
I think it's because that's when you can do like the nameless avatar, right? It's just like you just get to be a guy, which is the classic video game move. It story wise, there's not much to it. It's really just like Prodigium. You're going down to hunt things down. The game itself is good. I mean, I think it's a bad adaptation, I guess you could say, but like because it is so nondescript. But it's like a classic Metroidvania in short form. Like there's a bunch of like weapons that you can like find hidden throughout the world that are like completely optional, like abilities and weapons that are optional, which is very cool. It's not just kind of like a straight linear thing. There's actually reason to explore. It has some like challenging boss fights that are very bullet spongy. They're very much inspired by like the original NES Metroid game, which is kind of a pain. But it is a good game, and I think it gets the one thing that I do think that it that has like parity with your universe of films, and I was thinking about making this pitch, is that it does the thing where it keeps it from a human perspective, which is what a lot of your films do, where it makes sure that your main character isn't just like super powered, the Mummy, Tom Cruise, like going crazy. It's a human who like has to gain power in order to take something down, and that kind of like lends it this tension and lends it a little bit of like it's not really a horror game, but it has I think some like light horror elements that you could kind of have in a game of that scale.
I think that's a good point, because one of the things, I mean, going back to our first episode, we talked about the problem with Prodigium is that they're like having this kind of all-powerful organization that knows how to kill all the things is like inherently sort of anti-horror and erases the mystery. But like you said, you're just an anonymous like grunt in this one, which sort of reverses that in a good way. It's a good way of having Prodigium, but maintaining some horror elements, because you're just, you're fodder, you're cannon fodder for this organization, and you have to like, and the feature the gameplay element I really liked was that when you die, every time you die in the game, you're now playing as a new person. Like they have sent a new Prodigium agent to replace you, and your old body comes back to life. And
as like a mummy, yeah,
as
basically.
a mummy,
Like an
and-
enemy you have to defeat at that point.
And
Yes.
and so when you
I love
die, you come back without any of the upgrades that you've gotten, and you have to kill the previous agent to take all their upgrades back.
That's terrific.
Yeah.
I like that a lot.
And that's a very fun twist on the Metroidvania that I thought was really cool and very narratively interesting and
Yeah.
little
So
bonus thing.
so despite the fact that I think this game is not like really the direction that we're going to go in here, I do think there are some learnings from it. And if you want, I can kind of start to get into my methodology for coming up with this pitch and preamble to kind of what the pitch itself is. Unless you have another question you want to ask here.
No,
before we
I
get into
think the transition here. I think you said that it's a good game, but it's a bad adaptation.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because yes, but also when no one likes the movie, it's almost
Yeah.
like, at least for the studio, it's a good adaptation because there is
Yes.
reason to play this game, even if you haven't seen the movie or if you don't like the movie. Like, you can still buy this. And, like, if anyone out there, if you want a cool Metroidvania game to play for $20, you can get The Mummy Demastered. And, like, there is reason to play this game even if you don't care about the movie, because it's a bad adaptation of the movie.
Yeah,
and so
exactly.
it doesn't have to get saddled with the stuff, with a bunch of lore or things about the movie that no one likes or remembers or wants to know about. But for our Dark Universe, which everyone loves and everyone is invested in, we do want to have probably a tie-in game that is a little bit more, a less anonymous, than The Mummy Demastered maybe is. So without further ado, let's start getting into it.
Yeah, so let's start with a kind of preamble here, which is it's a very complicated project because there are so many films here, there are so many different films, and the question comes up of like, well, how do we represent this?
And different styles of films.
And different styles of films. So there's the really easy method, right? The easy method is just like, if I'm the head of EA, right, or Ubisoft, I say, hey, we're ordering a character action adventure game like God of War or Spider-Man or whatever, where you play as one of the monsters and it's like a fun thing that goes with the movie and you're very powerful and that's fun. If I want to get like ambitious with that, it's maybe a multiplayer game, like a Gotham Knights situation where it's a team-up game where multiple people can play and it's co-op. And the most ambitious level of that, and probably the most bound to fail, is also it's a live service game and,
the Avengers version.
Yeah, it's the Avengers. I didn't want to do any of those. And the reason I didn't want to do any of those is because I started thinking about, like, I think a lot of game adaptations come from this place where they start with what they want the game to be, and then they're like, how do we fit the movie into it? And I think it goes the other way too. I think with a lot of video games adapted into films, they start with like, what's the genre movie we want to make, and how does the video game fit into it? So I didn't want to just go like, okay, let's do the basic thing and figure out how the Dark Universe fits into it. I wanted to start with the Dark Universe, determine what is important about the Dark Universe, and then adapt that into a game that made way more sense.
Love this.
And so I sat down and I started thinking about what is important, having listened and watched all these films and loved all of these films, right? big fan of these films. Invisible Man, really one of the best comedies of the 2020s. Jekyll Hyde, just a deep and harrowing film.
You're really good at pitching because to sweet talk.
You just gotta butter us
you're
up the whole
pitching
time.
to.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've already started adding. I've added another 0 to the pitch.
Yeah, good. I'm going to need them.
Yeah.
So here are the things that I kind of came up with as an outsider to this Dark Universe. The things that are important to the Dark Universe that have to be in a game. Number one, I think at their core, even though these are kind of like, Hollywood blockbusters, they're very fun action adventure movies, they're horror movies at their core, or at least have horror DNA at their core.
Yes.
You've talked about that a lot on this podcast. I wanted to make sure that element was kept here. I wanted to make sure that in this kind of like push for mass appeal, we don't flatten that out, right? Like we have a horror element to this game.
Which
no
has
matter
been the
what it
challenge
is.
of the Dark Universe in general,
Yes.
is like, how do we make a franchise without flattening out the horror elements? And,
Exactly.
Like, trying to retain those.
And I think we have more flexibility with games than we do with movies here, in that regard. Two, very narrative driven, despite the fact that like this is again a fun action adventure thing. Like you two are taking a lot of time to write these stories and write these arcs, and like make these stories that are intersecting and that you're actually putting time into. They're not throwaway stories just to get to action sequences, like a Transformers situation or something. And so I wanted to keep the narrative element of it alive as well. 2 or 3, this is something you've talked about a lot as well, is the anthology nature of Phase 1 is really fascinating, right? How these are all like different horror movies that are kind of in one anthology, and even the Dark Legion film, the crossover film, plays like an anthology of 4 different horror films. And that was like a really interesting part of how you structured that. So I actually liked that anthology idea and thought that to represent Phase 1, there should be an aspect of that to this. And so that's something that came to it. Like Mummy Demastered, I do think that keeping a human perspective in it is kind of important to introducing it, especially if we're going to do a kind of like horror adjacent route. So I wanted to have that be a little bit of a part of it as well. And then most importantly, and this goes back to Mummy Demastered as well, death in your universe is very important. In the Dark Universe, like death is a key thing that is part of this film because there is like a fate worse than death. Right? Like the thing that lies beyond death's door, like people can resurrect, right? People come back in this universe all the time, but like the consequences of that are what actually matter. And going beyond death's door is what is actually impactful. And with games, it's really tough because death doesn't matter, right? So many times in games, you die, you just reboot. It doesn't matter. It's like very rare to actually get to that place where death matters. And so that was important here. And so I started asking myself, putting all those things together and asking myself, like, how we can build a game off it, right? That we can build a narrative-focused game that is horror, that maybe has an anthology aspect to it, that keeps a human focus and where death matters. And once I started putting that together, the answer to this question became extremely simple. And so, submitting for the approval of the board that will take it to Universal to get the final sign off on this.
Submitting for our approval so we can submit it to someone else's approval.
I submit Dark Legion Omnibus, a game developed by Supermassive Games. And let me give you the back of the box description, and then I will explain this further, the choice with the developer especially. But the back of the box description, just off the bat. Dark Legion Omnibus is a narrative horror anthology from the studio behind Until Dawn and The Quarry. Players assume the role of a researcher investigating a series of supernatural cases that appear to be linked. Through 4 distinct stories spanning a century, players will make high-stakes choices that will affect the fate of each tale's heroes. Based on the Universal's hit Dark Legion films, players will cross paths with Frankenstein, the Wolfman, Dr. Jekyll, the Mummy, and more in a chilling horror adventure. Now, for people who don't know much about Supermassive Games, and I don't know how familiar the two of you are with them.
I think I might have played a bit of Until Dawn.
Yes.
And I think I confused them with Supergiant Games.
No, sorry. It's not Hades. That would be very cool if it was Hades. Supermassive Games has a very, very specific niche, which is that they are kind of making interactive horror movies. They're not like filmed, it's still like they look like a video game, but essentially what they are is that they are telling these like slasher movies that you get to affect. You are largely interacting with them by making dialogue choices. There are exploration segments where you walk around as characters and explore and find clues and, lore as to what the story is. It's a lot of like, you are presented with choices and you have to make choices that shape the story. And also these like quick time event sequences where like there will be chase sequences where, it's like hit square really quick, hit X really quick. And that's kind of how their games work. And what's interesting about their games is that, again, they're kind of like these teen slasher movies a lot of the time, where you are kind of controlling a kind of classic film. Until Dawn is this sort of game where you are a bunch of kids going to a cabin for the weekend and, classic. Things go wrong. You're on an Indian burial ground. It's like this classic, horror movie setup. And The Quarry, which came out last year, is a game where you are kids at a summer camp in a quarry, and it's like a werewolf, game essentially.
I really need to play The Quarry.
It's cool. It's really cool. Until Dawn is better.
List.
But it's cool.
Until Dawn is better?
Oh, Until Dawn is, I think, fantastic. I actually played Until Dawn this past week for this podcast. I had heard a lot about it. I hadn't played it.
I think I have it downloaded, and I played like maybe like an hour of it, and for some reason got distracted by something else. So I gotta play it.
They are tonally, I think, matched for what you do, because on top of all of this, on top of the fact that they are doing like kind of tropey horror games that are, really like reverent of classic horror, they also have a series called Man of Medan, which is their anthology horror series. They release like one every year, and it's just like these different horror stories that, again, are these same kind of like narrative horror games. And what is interesting about their games is that you are controlling like a whole group of people, like an ensemble of characters. And like when you make choices that are wrong, like your characters can die and like be permanently dead, right? Like you are kind of like the director deciding, like in the slasher movie, like who lives and who dies, who makes it to the end.
Because they've written alternatives where, well, if this
Yes.
character dies at this point, then here's how everything else plays out.
Yep. And everything just like fluidly plays out from there. So in my mind, I thought that this was like a really good solution to this question of like death in the universe and whatnot. And so I started outlining a game based around this concept, right? This narrative horror game where gameplay wise, I'm not going to go too deep into gameplay because I think it's, pretty self-explanatory, right? Where like you are going to be kind of watching these interactive films. You are going to be making these dialogue choices, right? It's very character driven. It's very horror trope driven. And you are doing, like these different choices that come up where it's like, oh, should we stay? Should we go? And you have to make that choice. And that affects the story. You have these like tense sequences where you're doing this like, press the button at the right time thing, that kind of like classic thing that they do. And I have added a couple of twists to that. And there's a bunch of ways that we are going to differentiate this game and make it so it's not just like everything that they've done before, right? It's not just like slapping the Dark Legion onto it. I really do want this game, though, to be like Until Dawn with the Dark Legion. And I think that is like the best possible pitch for this.
I actually love that because, like I think it's a great format for keeping this a horror game. Like, I like...
And it is a horror game. I want to say that up front. This is like a horror game first and foremost.
Which is,
right?
it is perfect. Because like, I think, going into this, you told us like, it wasn't going to be whatever we were expecting. And you're right. Because I was definitely expecting like, okay, you take a control of all the different, monsters and you have their monster powers and thinking it was going to lean more towards some kind of action game, like a lot of fighting, a lot of combat, And
I had I thought that maybe it would be more of a survival horror situation where you put a single character and you have to have them alongside. Like I thought about the Ghostbusters game where you're the rookie Ghostbuster and you're following around the characters as they're doing antics, but you're completely expendable.
Yeah.
And
like
I thought about that too, but then I ran into the thing of like, well, how do you make death matter, right? I was kind of like, well, we want death to matter, right? And like, we don't just want it to be like your character died, you got back up, because then like it's not scary the second time, right? Like when you go do the horror sequence the second time, it's not scary. Like we don't want you to have to repeat things,
right?
And so that's why I kind of went away from that angle for sure. I thought about it, like I thought about all of these, and this was the only thing that I think solved everything that needs to be solved.
Yeah. I think it's a really intriguing choice. And I also always enjoy stuff like this where, especially when you think of like tie-in games, you often think of being kind of, disposable. This adds an element of replayability where you will want to see how the outcome changes as you make different decisions.
100%.
And in as we sort of mentioned, how our franchises, we're always trying to keep our horror roots. And sometimes we succeed at that and sometimes we fail. And sometimes things just sort of have to get more action-y. I think by starting our external to movies franchise stuff with like a dedicated horror game is really good for that and helps us keep kind of our horror bona fides and like and also I feel like we're always trying to course correct back to horror and like you haven't heard this yet because we just taped it, but we were talking about our phase 2 planning and wanting to do more movies where the monsters aren't the main character, but we have human characters who are interacting with the monsters. And I think this is a great step towards that course correction where now we're going to be playing with people who can die and give us stakes and our monsters will be involved, but you're not necessarily like, here's a game where you play as Nick Morton and you can have Frankenstein as your player too. So
here's how I want to structure this. And this is going to be like a whole thing. This is going to take a bit to get through, but
good. Wait, before we do that, since we're going to dive into the structure, why don't we take a quick break?
Yes.
We're going to hear a little teaser right now for Giovanni's podcast, Left Trigger, Right Trigger, which is an excellent podcast about video games. So please check that out. And when we come back, we're going to get into the nitty gritty of the Dark Legion Omnibus coming soon to PlayStation 6, Xbox.
The development cycle is going to take a bit.
Whatever.
Xbox 1080.
Yep. And we'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm David.
I'm Tess.
I'm Giovanni.
And I'm Greg. And we're Left Trigger, Right Trigger, your video game book club.
Each episode, we pick a topic, and each of us brings a video game that we think best fits that topic.
Tune into the show to find out how Super Mario Land is all about travel.
Or how Bloodborne is a game about sacrifice.
Or how SimCity is actually a conspiracy to mine data about human infrastructure.
No,
we have to
Greg,
stop that since we're giving all
let's
our
not do
big
this
data.
right now.
And we have to talk.
We're doing it's a promo. Please stop.
Intrigued? A little scared? Us too. Make sure to catch us every other Tuesday on your favorite podcatcher app. See you there.
Welcome back to Are You Afraid of the Dark Universe? We're sitting here talking to Giovanni Colantonio about the Dark Legion Omnibus, the big video game tie-in to the Dark Universe. And when we left off, Gio was just about to get into the structure of the game and get more into the details of his vision.
Yes. So I'm happy to go into this now. And what I'll say off the bat is I didn't go into like beat by beat story details. I wanted this to be a little bit more of like how the game is going to work and whatnot. But I did kind of write some like loose, pieces of story here just to sort of like get us to where we need to be. And maybe we can discuss some of the story afterwards and whatnot. But some of these strokes are very broad. Like, I mean, I really just kind of was like, here's where it's set and the universe is set in and, we'll figure it out after that.
Yeah.
I guess the thing to know here is that this is going to unfold like an anthology where there is going to be like a through line story that is kind of like a frame tale. But from there, you are going into these 4 different stories that are standalone kind of horror movies that have details that intersect with one another. There are going to be clues, within each one that kind of build to a larger story and kind of connect to one another. But everything is kind of like building to this kind of a plot that will end the game.
Yeah.
So in terms of structure, how it begins is this. You open the game on this character who I have one of the only 2 casting decisions I made for this game. One thing about Supermassive games is that they always like cast actual actors for them.
Yes. Love this.
They like actually get people into them. They like to work with a lot of like horror people. Until Dawn features Rami Malek is like a big character in it, and Hayden Panettiere or whatever from of
the
Heroes
actors
fame
are like
originally.
very recognizable in the and this is perfect because if for whatever reason we decide this character, if they survive, comes into the Dark Universe, we can just cast that actor.
Yeah.
Exactly. So the main character that is like the frame character of this, I did like very little. I wanted to get like horror movie people into this, so I actually went with Micah Monroe, who is from It Follows.
Yeah.
Oh,
and I was kind of like thought might be a fun like person to just have as like this kind of character at the beginning of it. Basically, it opens with Micah Monroe's character. Dark Night. She is kind of like going on this stormy night to this kind of dilapidated library. Just like an old, creepy, classic library.
And this is in the present day.
Yes, present day.
Okay.
All takes place in present day. And what I'll say is this right off the bat. Structurally, this game takes a lot of inspiration, and this game in general takes a lot of inspiration from the best horror game, I'll call it, Called Shot, the best horror video game of all time, which real ones know is Eternal Darkness Sanity's
Hell
Requiem for the
yeah.
Nintendo GameCube.
You are so right. Love Eternal Darkness.
So what this is going to be, Eternal Darkness, for people who don't know, it's this game that's kind of like almost an anthology horror game where it's this girl going to her grandfather's mansion after he's died mysteriously and trying to find like the secret of the family. And what happens is the mansion acts as this like hub that you go to in between missions where you find like a different piece of family lineage. And then that takes you into a story about that family member that is like, each one is a completely different time. It's a completely different part of history. The weapons and like items and mechanics are totally different. And it's this very cool anthology game where you are kind of going through that. Kind of the same setup here. We're going to have this frame story about like this kind of person researching something. And from there, we are going to go into the meat of the game, which is the 4 stories. So you are Micah Monroe. You come up to this library. You kind of come to the desk and you start asking the person behind the desk to start pulling all these things for you. You are interested in these like 4 events that you are researching for some reason. The librarian behind the counter. In every supermassive game, there's always this character between chapters who is like just this like eccentric weirdo who's like kind of a horror great or like a character actor great who just kind of like gets to wax weird between the chapters to kind of link things together and be creepy. I've chosen Kathy Bates as the
I was
role
about
of,
to
like,
say
the creepy-
Barbara Crampton, but I like Kathy Bates.
That works too. But Kathy Bates has like I think a kind of like librarian vibe to her, and
Absolutely.
I think can play and horror roots as well, and also in anthology horror as well. So it's a nice kind of parody with that. And so like goes up to Kathy Bates, is like, I need case files on this, this story, this thing. She comes back and she places down on the counter this whole pile of things, right? This pile of books, newspaper clippings, tabloids, like all of these things that she's pulled relating to these 4 specific case files. The camera pans down, we're looking at the desk, and this is our kind of like mission select screen, where you're looking at a desk, there's these like different piles of things, and then from there, you're going to navigate into one of 4 stories. The way this is going to work structurally, like that's our UI, is that there are going to be 4 stories that you can go into here. Each one is split into 3 acts and is about 45 minutes an act. The act structure kind of came from how you pitch your films, where you are kind of breaking them up that way as well. And you can play them in kind of like any order, in the sense of like, do you just want to do one story all the way through? Cool. Do you want to do chapter 1 of each, and then chapter 2 of each, and then chapter 3 of each?
Right,
was
like
wondering
Lego
about
Star
that.
Wars style.
Yeah. And I was kind of thinking of like the Arrested Development season, where they were like, you can watch it in any order, but you like kind of couldn't. Where I was like, I want you to be able to play these chapters in whatever order you want. And like, there are going to be clues in each one that like kind of give more color to the lore. Like they intersect. So I want there to be that element of like, ooh, I did all the Wolfman stuff. But like, I went into this other chapter and found this thing that like related back to something in this story. And all of these stories, I want to have this kind of like generational appeal. So it's going to happen over the course of 100 years.
Okay.
So there are 4 different stories, and they all take place in different parts of the Dark Universe. There's going to be one thing that's missing, but it is accounted for, I promise. And we'll get to that. So story 1. And these are all like slightly different genres. They're all going to play kind of the same, but with like slight variations to the formula.
No, I think that's perfect.
Story 1 is set in the world of the Mummy. I want this. This is why I texted you before this, asking about Prodigium's lore. I kind of wanted to keep that element of Mummy Demastered for some reason. I don't know why I gravitated towards it too. So I guess we're all on the same page here. I wanted to follow a group of like Prodigium soldiers, but early Prodigium, like early 1900s, right?
Okay.
Who are raiding the mummy's tomb from like, back before Tom Cruise gets involved, when we're dealing with the original Mummy. And they're kind of like raiding this tomb for whatever reason, right? And we can figure out the story beats of that, whatever the exact reasons, gets into the lore of Prodigium and kind of like early monsters. This is going to be more of an action like horror game, I think, than all the other ones, right? It's going to be a little more like gunplay heavy, where it's kind of like, you have to, there's a thing in Until Dawn where you have a gun, but it's like a quick time event to like line up the shot and get it in time.
It's not like
events
a first
like that are
person
going to happen in this
kind of thing.
No, it's very much like there will, a lot of the decisions and timing you will have to do will revolve around like, you have these like 1900s, early 1900s rifles or something, or like torches or things like that. And you're kind of navigating this tomb. Again, like a little action heavy, a little adventure heavy, still horror and whatnot. And you are kind of like fending off these monsters in this tomb. It's also going to be like kind of lore heavy, because again, we're getting into the early days of Prodigium and kind of what happens here. And it is going to reveal some grand details kind of like about death in this universe, right? And like death's door, that is going to be a central part of whatever the story is. And that's going to kind of be the story there, right? It's going to be this self-contained mummy story that is very action-focused. Again, you are like a crew of like 3 or 4 people. Some of them can die throughout your choices you can make through this. And it is building towards this kind of finale confrontation, with the mummy, right? From the original thing. So that's story 1. Story 2, this one, I don't know the exact timeline that you have for this, but I want to do one that is set in the kind of world of Frankenstein, where we are dealing in the period where he is like in Antarctica, like locked away, right before he gets kind of taken from Prodigium. I kind of want this to be like our Alien equivalent horror movie, where it's like there is the one monster. It's like, and a little bit of The Thing, I guess, setting wise too. That like, so you're kind of like a team of random explorers in Antarctica that like fall into this cave, right? That like classic kind of setup. And you have found yourselves in it, by accident, stuck in this cave where like Frankenstein has been holed away, right? And you kind of get into this like, you are being stalked by the persistent monster kind of situation, right? Where like you were being stalked by Frankenstein and like hunted by him, who's like pissed that you have like broken into his home, right?
Kind of alien
and you get that
isolation.
Like, yes.
A bit,
yeah, exactly.
wise.
And again, gameplay is going to be the kind of same, but like this is going to be like more stealth based, right? Like more like hiding from this. And the only thing I kind of feel about this story is that like, I think that we kind of learn through it that like Frankenstein maybe isn't the actual villain here, right? Like he might be trying to like maybe protect them from something that is the actual
I
horror
was
here
just
that we get
thinking
to by
that
Act
as you
3?
were talking.
Yes, because we've established the
Yeah.
idea that once he has his soul restored to him at the end of
Yes.
the Frankenstein movie, he's doesn't kill anymore until the Dark Legion.
So I think at the beginning we think that like he is kind of this horror monster, but we start to find out that maybe there's another force that is at play here, and that's the actual villain that like is going to carry through to whatever our A plot is, right?
Okay.
And we'll kind of get to that. So that timing wise, I'm thinking that I don't know when he's in that cave. I don't know if you established that in your world, like the period.
We could honestly set it anywhere because the sort of idea is that in 1831 is when he first goes to Antarctica and becomes frozen. And then in the present day, there is a mass like melting, like a
Global warming.
Exactly. Like basically a huge chunk of ice melts and like he's sort of released. But I think it makes sense that we could really say at any point in between, like he doesn't have to have been asleep the entire time. Like he could have woken up and like had like, you said this home in this cave and it maybe he's like trying to like go back into being frozen, but whatever this other force or our heroes, sort of prevent him from doing that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking like 40s, 50s for this, just because I want to have like each one be set during a very like kind of distinct time.
Yeah.
So that'll be that story. Story 3 is a classic teen slasher set in the world of the Wolfman universe. This is what Supermassive does really well. This is what essentially the Quarry already is. It's like a Wolfman teen slasher. And in this one, I'm thinking that it's like a group of teens that are on vacation in California. Their car breaks down and they find themselves in Talbot, California, trying to like, figure out where they are, get directions. And they happen to stumble into like the kind of Wolfman commune that you've set up in your lore where they're all helping one another. But they happen to come there on a night that's a full moon where like everything has gone wrong this night, right? The night, it's like the night where they're supposed to have locked each other up. But for some reason, all of the safety measures here have mysteriously broken down and they have to fight to survive, this wolf attack and kind of learn like what actually happened here. And again, I think that's where we have this like persistent villain of like, they didn't screw up. Somebody screwed them up. Like somebody like got them out of their cages or something, or like screwed up the system. And that's like this other layer of mystery that we're kind of learning through this, right? That's my kind of thought there on a really general level. Very classic teen slasher movie. The one that's most kind of gameplay wise resembling, I think like, the Quarry and Supermassive's games. I think it'll be the one that like,
Here's what I love
now
about this.
Go ahead.
Maybe you have the same thought. You might be about to say the same thing I am, which is
Go ahead.
we bring back John Bernthal.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Exactly.
Well, because we could have it set before the events of the Wolfman. We don't have a clear timeline on when that comic put together, other than his sister Carol, a different Carol from the Carol you introduced in the following film.
Yeah.
We have a lot of Jennies and a lot of Carols. I went back and realized it. But anyway,
no.
But Detective Poole's sister sets this up after he becomes turned, but we don't know how long he's been a werewolf. So I'm thinking about the idea of you have set these in these different time periods, and they're each maybe sort of spikes in the history of horror cinema. Like maybe we think of that first one. That first one that you had set at the turn of the century is maybe in the 30s when the original Universal movies were being made. And then we have the 50s, which
or even
is
earlier
another
with like the Lon Chaney Sr. stuff with like the silent Phantom of the Opera.
But like
type
golden,
stuff.
golden age of Hollywood type stuff. And then you have the other one, which is the 50s, your big creature feature boom. And then this
when
one,
the original Thing came out,
has kind of the feel, even if it's not exactly set there, 80s or 90s slasher boom.
Yeah, exactly.
And we bring John Bernthal back, but we can de-age him through the
play a
magic
young
of video
John
games.
Bernthal, yeah.
Exactly. He's like maybe a teen version. We honestly don't even need him necessarily. Well, I guess if it's at the commune, we do need that to be set up. So yeah, this is like he's just been turned.
And
maybe
it could be
this
the
is
early days, and that's one of the reasons it's easier to fuck with them.
Maybe this is their first season. They've just set it up. John Bernthal has just changed. This is like his first year as a werewolf.
Then it becomes kind of an origin story for like the Villalobos gym and their whole thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
That works out perfectly.
I love that. Cool. And then the fourth story, I'm thinking this is more of our like modern thing, and this is more of like a psychological horror procedural almost. I was like almost thinking of like Seven, or like, even like, even if I'm going like really modern, like kind of the Batman kind of like has this vibe too in some way. And that is the world of Jekyll X Hyde. Right. I think this is like a detective story where they're called in to investigate like this really grisly murder that's like in Brooklyn somewhere. Right. And this has like a little bit more of like investigative gameplay to it. Right. It's like you piecing together this crime that happened and finding clues. And like, Jekyll is presumably involved in it, or they think Jekyll is involved in it in some way. I think this is like kind of that classic like grisly kind of like horror, right? Like less of a jump out and scare you thing, but more of like a just like disturbing imagery and whatnot.
Yeah.
I was kind of likening this gameplay wise to almost like Silent Hill, right? Where it's like that kind of like dark kind of horror. It's not as pop out and scare you. Maybe there's like some light puzzle elements to it, but it's also a lot of just like finding clues, exploration, like, piecing things together, in the regular framework of this game as well. And again, there is some sort of murder here. We think Jekyll and Hyde has to do with it, but like, again, perhaps there's this other force at play that carries over into this as well. And this can be like kind of a 2000s, I think maybe horror as well.
The sort of like peak elevated horror time period.
Yeah.
And we bring
exactly.
back our boy, Russell Crowe, who we just killed off, but we can give him another job.
Mm-hmm. Do you think he'll do a video game?
Absolutely not.
I think he would be down.
John Bernthal would definitely do it.
I think
he could,
absolutely.
Yeah. And again, all these stories have like a cast of 3 or 4 characters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where like there is the chance for them to die and whatnot. You'll notice that someone is missing here, which is the Invisible Man. Was hard to work him in because of the thing, but I did find a way to get him in.
Okay.
Which is that Supermassive games have this feature where there's like a mechanic in a lot of them where they give you a way to kind of like see the future a little bit, to see like what a choice will do through like a collectible. So in the Quarry, there's this kind of, you can get tarot cards through the game. Like you can find them hidden in levels, and they'll show you like a brief, like 1 second snippet of like, a character dying or something.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, oh, I kind of can infer like when you get to the moment in the game where that happens, like, oh, if I do this choice, I can save them, right? It's kind of your chance to, if you're observant and explore, kind of be able to predict it and manipulate it a little bit. Until Dawn has a system that's like totems, and you find totems that like show you different things like fortune or death or danger or whatever to foreshadow that. I figured that was a good mechanic to keep here, and have that be kind of our collectible as well. So what I'm kind of thinking here is like some sort of like prophecy that is like maybe these scrolls or something, right? Like I don't know what the exact thing would be, but my mind kind of went to scrolls just because it kind of related to the mummy and whatnot, that are hidden around levels. And the way that you find them is they are actually like hidden in invisible things in the world that you have to find, right?
Okay.
Like perhaps there's like a piece of trash that's floating in the air and you're like, that shouldn't be there. And then you look and there's like, oh, there's this invisible trash can, and you like interact with it and you pull something out from it. And then that way we can like have that nod to the Invisible Man, right? Maybe there's a sort of like, explicit tie-in to him. Maybe it's just sort of like a wink or whatnot. But that's our collectible that kind of ties him in, and allows us to do that mechanic of like, hey, we're going to give you these like tiny winks, right? That like that show you how your fate's going to go, these prophecies and whatnot. And so that's how I was thinking of mechanically bringing that in and paying tribute to him as well.
I like that also.
Which I think is fun.
Lets you have these little cheeky moments that incorporate the tone of the Invisible Man without straying too far from the horror thing that you want to do.
Yeah.
I'm thinking it's kind of like funny, like the things that are invisible. It's like almost like gags, like sight gags in the world where it's like, something is out of place and you like see it and you're like, oh, that's funny. Like this thing is kind of missing, and you interact with it and you figure it out. I agree. Like it gives us a little bit of levity through this collectible. And the other collectible that happens in this is like different kind of pieces of lore that you can find through the world. This happens in Until Dawn, where you find like different newspaper clippings or like clues or whatnot. Again, we'll keep that. They're clues, that build out the lore and build out the overall kind of A plot. In between each story, you get to these interstitials, like I talked about, where you kind of like have Kathy Bates. Again, you in Supermassive games, you have interstitials with like these characters kind of like being creepy, and they're usually these like character actors. The Quarry has Grace Zabriskie from Twin Peaks, Laura Palmer's mother herself, who just like is this creepy kind of woman, who is like, she's the one who reads the tarot cards, and in between each chapter, she just kind of like, waxes poetic, but by the end she like ties into the story, the grand story that it's telling. Until Dawn has a phenomenal performance by Michael Stromae?
Peter Stormare?
Yeah, I think Peter Stormare. Yeah. Yes, I think that's right.
Cool.
He has like this great performance where he's like a psychologist, like who is like interrogating you in between chapters, and like it ties back to the game and eventually ties into the A plot. I want Kathy Bates to have this role here where like we come back from the chapters, we're kind of in first person. She's like waxing poetic, and weird, and through the game it starts to kind of make more sense, and she is tied to the story. But once you finish all 12 chapters, you build towards the finale. It's the final chapter where we actually get to control Micah Monroe's character, where we're putting the character of her, and she like cracks whatever this grand mystery is, right? Whatever she has set out to do, and learn about, she kind of like figures out, and we get this kind of hour-long chapter where she gets her own story, self-contained. In my head, it feels like we should build to a Dracula thing here. That's kind of
just thinking that as you were saying, because I've been trying to like, as you've been talking, I'm racking my brain on like, is there a universal monster like we could use that hasn't been, but we have plans for Creature from the Black Lagoon. We have plans for Phantom of the Opera. Hunchback of Notre Dame wouldn't really fit in here.
So here's my thought. Do we have the A plot of this have to do with like vampires are behind a lot of these things that happened, right? Like all these monster things, like they're the ones who kind of let out the wolfmen from their cages or whatever, right? Like they are the ones who are like hunting down Frankenstein in his cave, and he's the one he's actually trying to kill. Like they tie back to the mummy, like whatever, all this. And then here's my like really left field pitch about this. Do we reveal that Micah Monroe's character is a descendant of Lucy Westenra, who, if you don't know, in the lore of the 1897 Dracula novel, is the first woman that Dracula turns in that novel. I was thinking this idea of like she is a descendant of that woman who is like kind of we actually learn is like trying to learn about her family history and like, what happened to her like great grandmother or whatever. And I was kind of thinking like that might be a fun way to turn it in and like make her into a character that is like has a basis in the literature, in the lore of this. And, it gives her a reason to be investigating this. Perhaps there's like a vampire thing. She's trying to find Dracula because like, I don't know, she wants to like kill the person that like turned her family member, or just know what happened. And we build to this like final story where she like learns about all these atrocities that like these vampires have committed that have affected her family throughout the ages. If we want to go really Eternal Darkness, we could have all of these stories like be her family members. We learn like this is her lineage, right. And we're dealing with different people. That could be something that kind of comes into play here. Again, don't have like the final story beat of that, but that's kind of what I was thinking might make sense to build to, and how we could tie Dracula in and kind of mirror, the Dark Universe films with having him be the big bad.
I think that's interesting to the extent that there might be a role for her in Dracula Lives.
Well, okay, so I have a couple thoughts here.
Yeah.
One, I really like that, and I think that, as you said, that we could then bring Micah Monroe into the Dark Universe, possibly.
Not making any promises, but a thought occurs to me as to, if this were to be canon to our universe, a way that we could tie it back in the way that I'm always kind of hoping characters from Jedi Fallen Order will show up and like Obi-Wan or something.
So I might go even bigger though, and we can shoot this down. But what if it's not that she's the descendant of Lucy, but she is the daughter of Van Helsing and Mina?
Ooh.
And this is a follow-up to House of Dracula. And what the twist is at the end is you find out in this last section that every person you've played at has been a Van Helsing, has been someone in the Van Helsing lineage. And you've been playing as Van Helsings the whole time. And at the end, she confronts the living Dracula as sort of a prequel to Dracula Lives. She doesn't kill him, obviously, but we get a we know Mads Mikkelsen will do a video game.
He'll love it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And we have a sort of verbal confrontation between the living Dracula, Mads Mikkelsen, and the daughter of Van Helsing. And then we can bring Micah Monroe possibly into it in the future as she tries to become a vampire hunter like her father and all these.
She could be your new Van Helsing. Yeah.
Yeah. Would be great use of the character. Like I like the idea of integrating this. Like when we do these pitch meetings, we of course have to have the right of refusal. Things are not automatically canon when you pitch them to us. However, everything about this, once again, we're in this situation where like, fuck, I'd like to play this game. That'd be really cool.
I would love to play
me too.
So far, I am intrigued by the idea of introducing this character and having this game be in its own way a bridge story between phase 1 and phase 2 through this character.
Yeah. I like that. And also we don't have to use her. Like we could just say like, okay, she confronts Dracula and, she doesn't become we just don't have to necessarily pick up that thread, but it's a very story rich thread to pick up on if we wanted to. And we could introduce her in a film without people having played the video game, because all you would really have to say is, well, she's the daughter of Van Helsing, and there's
require a lot of
deal,
things. It's the Saw Gerrera thing. You don't have to have watched Clone Wars.
And I built this very specifically to give you this option. I wanted to build a story that could slot into canon if you wanted it to, but also it could not if you didn't want it to. This is something that will not interfere or mess with any of the lore you built. It goes back through history. It lets you play in these periods that you're probably not going to touch really, but still interacts with these characters. So I think the flexibility is there if you want to take ideas from this, and kind of actually use elements from the story. It's there. But yeah, I kind of wanted it to be a Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order thing where you can kind of take it or leave it as part of lore, but it exists. It doesn't conflict with anything. It's part of lore.
It's not creating homework for fans who just want to watch the movies, but it does add texture. I think that's exactly what sort of tie-in media, be it comics or novels or video games, should do, is that it should provide greater context without actually having to, without becoming an essential piece of the puzzle.
And I'm thinking now that, as we have our enemies in each of the stories, do we maybe make those sort of like Dracula's familiars throughout the years? I was just thinking about how the Renfield trailer just came out, and we haven't involved Renfield, who is a classic Dracula character, in our Dark Universe yet. Maybe one of the bosses. I know these games don't really have bosses, but one of the villains in one of the timepieces is Renfield, and another time it's a different familiar, all these people doing Dracula's bidding for different purposes, trying to get, something from the mummy's tomb that will add to his immortality, or, things like that.
Great opportunity to bring in my boy Chip Lester at some point.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. We can bring back people we've killed off.
And you don't have to kill any of these characters introduced. If you want to introduce a Renfield here or an adaptation of him, in these games, it's more about survival, right? It's more you surviving this thing. And a lot of these are set up where it's the escaping from Frankenstein's lair thing, is more about just escaping, right? If you don't want to have, a committal to and then they chop someone's head off, you can still have that villain and still have a satisfying ending. Is there any more we want to say about story? Because there's one more mechanical thing that I'm just through the moon about that I want to get to, but I want to make sure that you kind of feel we have these broad strokes of a story, right? There is Dracula's familiars through the ages are we have this woman, we don't know her deal. She's reading about all these stories where Dracula's familiars are causing these different problems through the century. We later learn by the end of the game, by piecing things together and all these clues, that there were Van Helsings, in all of these, and she is of this lineage and trying to become the next Van Helsing or whatnot. And she, uses this knowledge once she figures out what happened to confront Dracula. And there's a horror sequence where she goes to his castle or whatever, and there's some vampires that she has to escape from, whatever. That would be kind of the grand overarching thing, where she discovers that he's just a pathetic alive man, right? That's it. Do we feel good about that as kind of is there anything here that maybe feels out of step that we would have to change, that anyone else you would want to bring in character wise or tweak?
I don't think we, I think it's beyond the scope of this episode to nail in every single plot beat. Something I'm thinking is as we're talking about all these familiars and stuff, it would be nice if it wasn't always the same kind of familiar in each story, because that would maybe get predictable especially if you're playing them all the way through one at a time. Maybe we come up with different versions of monsters or things that are adjacent to Dracula, but are all sort of unique in their own way.
And if we're playing with the sort of different eras of horror cinema as well throughout these, then there's a possibility of kind of theming each of them after an unrelated kind of movie. I don't know, in the 50s one, you could do I'm getting really far afield here, but you could have a fucking giant ant creature. I don't know.
Well, I was kind of actually thinking in the Frankenstein one, if maybe in the cave where he's done, where he's found this home, nearby is this ancient blood repository where they're keeping blood frozen in the ice. and something has melted, and there is a thing, like some sort of like virus has mutated in the blood that is now like infecting people. So you do kind of do like a thing, or what's that episode of the X-Files in the first one?
It's called Ice.
Yeah, the Ice episode of X-Files, where like there's some sort of kind of intangible virus like kind of spreading that like Frankenstein is trying to like sort of protect them from, but they think he's the villain when really it's like actually something they can't see or something like that.
So it's not always a human familiar, but it's always a different kind of horror threat that we can tie back to its original sort of origin as Dracula's organization.
And we can always, like you said, we can match them to the era. So maybe we find some way to do something kind of slashery with our Wolfman thing, you know?
Totally.
But I think this is enough for this pitch. And everything seems lined up really well. And I think this does help propel us into phase 2 and might give you some ideas for your Dracula Lives movie.
Yeah, I mean, I've got... it's an angle I had not considered to do to have an heir to Van Helsing in it, but I do think that it's a kind of wrinkle that fits into the story that I want to tell.
And
so
if you don't use it,
if I don't use it, it's fine.
Yeah,
right. But
totally.
But I am intrigued. And I think anything, we always talk about we want to always be additive. That's exciting to me.
This feels like a additive story that helps flesh out things that we just simply wouldn't really be able to fit into the movie universe as it stands now.
Yeah. And like fun lore, again, being able to like play with the early days of Prodigium a little bit, I thought might be a little bit fun, getting to play with like the early days of the Wolf Commune and like kind of what happened when that was being set up. Getting to play with John Bernthal's character, I think is like a great idea for that storyline, like centering that around him.
I actually think there's a really great opportunity to maybe with the Mummy one, tell the story of why the Van Helsings aren't part of Prodigium. Maybe like we have like, this is at a point when Van Helsing is, or whatever Van Helsing existed at this time, does join up with Prodigium. And by the end of the story, we see him being like, I want nothing to do with you. And that's why this legendary vampire hunter has never been part of this organization. And that kind of helps tell that story.
Totally. And the only one I'm not totally sure on is like where you go with Jekyll Hyde, again, doing this like procedural kind of situation. I don't know if that really is something we need to necessarily hammer out.
Not necessarily, but we could also have Hugh Dancy's Abraham Van Helsing in that story.
They would be contemporaries,
Yeah, that might be a good idea. Cool. Last mechanic I want to talk about here. Because again, as we talked about in the beginning, the important thing that I wanted to get across here is how we handle death.
Yes.
Right? How do we handle death in this game? We know that death is really important, and that it should be more than just like a character dies and that's it, right? So supermassive games are already in a good spot because like, your characters die and they're out of the story for good, usually in those games. Though in The Quarry, they do have a system where you have a couple of saves. You have like 4 or 5 saves throughout the game that you can burn, where like if you make a bad decision that like, oh, I didn't realize this was going to happen, you like have a limited amount of saves and you can kind of save them. I liked that idea because I do think that like it's nice to have like a little bit of flexibility for the player, but I was in this kind of spot where I was like, well, I don't want to like overdo that, and I don't want to demean death. So here's where it gets weird. This is my combination of Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, and Call of Duty Warzone. And what it means is this. I'm calling this the resurrection system, which is throughout the game, you are going to have 4 resurrections that you can do, right? And this, kind of ties back to the Mummy, in that way too. Resurrections are part of this universe where like there are going to be a lot of chances where characters can die and you can save them 4 times, right? Like that's it. When you save them, you essentially have this like really trippy sequence that I'm kind of comparing to like the Batman Arkham like Scarecrow sequences, those like really weird kind of like surreal sequences that happen where like you just have to do this like quick escape sequence where you are like at death's door, or you like kind of see like the veil beyond death, right? We visualize that in some way. You have to come back from it. Like, there's a little bit of a challenge. So it's not just like you press a button and you rewind time and that's it. And like, you can bring a character back up to 4 times. So like once per story, or like, maybe you end up using 2 in one story and you're like, oh, I can't do it later.
Yeah.
But I wanted that to have an actual consequence to it. Like I wanted it to be like, give people the flexibility to like not totally screw up a story and be like, oh, like that's a bummer. I didn't understand what the decision would do and whatever. Like I wanted to give a little bit of that. But I still wanted those decisions to be impactful. And so I was thinking a lot about Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem. And the reason I say this is like Call of Duty Warzone is because that game has the idea of the gulag, where like when you die in the battle royale, you have like a chance to come back. And like, there's that opportunity. In Eternal Darkness, there is the sanity system, which you may remember from that game. It is the key component of that game where you have, in addition to a health bar, a sanity bar. And when you get like scared or different things like that, your sanity drains. It's a resource. And as it goes down, kind of like weird things will start to happen, right? Like if you have a little bit of sanity loss, like the walls will maybe start to bleed and you'll be like, that's weird. Like if you really have none left, like totally surreal, weird stuff will happen. That's like meta. There's like a thing in that game where like, it'll be like, your controller's disconnected. And you're like, what are you talking? And then you look and your controller's not. And then it like flashes. Right. It's like a jump scare that happens.
It's great.
And
Isn't
it's just
there
like,
something about like your save game data is corrupted, or like it says that like, your stuff's been deleted.
There's one where like it goes to a screen that's like, thanks for playing. You'll see the rest of the story in Eternal Darkness 2. And you're like, what? And then it like flashes back. There's one where you like, my favorite one in that game is like you walk into a room and your head falls off. And you're like, what the fuck? And then like, it's like pick up head and you hit the button and then it like comes up on screen as an item and it starts like reciting to be or not to be, and then like flashes and you're back, like you've lost your sanity. I wanted to take like a little bit of that system and add it here where you can use these resurrections, but every time you use one of the four, the game state permanently gets a little weird, right? Like just a little bit each time, it gets like a little bit off kilter. So like it starts where like if you use one of them, like it's pretty subtle, right? Use one resurrection and like maybe there's some like weird sound things that happen, right? Or like visual things that happen where you're like, that's not supposed to be there. That's weird. But nothing super distracting. But like if you use all four by the end of the story, like the idea here is that like you have defied death, but in doing so, you have let a little evil out of death's door each time you have done that, right? Which ties back to the films and I think is consistent with like the thought process that you have there, if I recall correctly. Like there are consequences to resurrection as far as I can tell in the film or in the films. So the idea is that like you are bringing a little bit of evil back with you, and that is going to kind of mess up the state of the game permanently. And it can like, be those simple things, or, this is a very like quick time event heavy game. Like maybe those get inverted, right? It's like you're supposed to hit the triangle button, and it's like usually up here and like now it's down here, or like the colors of the buttons change or like something like that, right? Yeah. We can just like, or you can just do those kind of like Eternal Darkness moments where you have these like jump scares that aren't supposed to be there for like a quick second and you're like, what the hell? And the idea of that is that like it will make the game harder because it's permanently altering the world state, right? And like if you choose to save everyone in these story, like the first story you play, then like you're gonna have a hard time saving people up front. So you have to make those choices of like, oh, maybe I should let this character die, right? Like I don't care about this character too much. I don't need to see their story. Like I'm going to let this person die because like I want to save these valuable, like resurrections that I have for later in the game and not make it harder to accomplish that, right? Because, you're going to get messed with through this game if you use too many of them, and like that's going to make it so that like it might be harder to make choices and you might like risk losing more characters because of it. And so like that's how I want to make death impactful in this. That's how I want to offer flexibility to like make decisions, but also make it so that like death matters. It is a choice that you have to make. Resurrection is important. There are things worse than death. Like, if you come back, like you are kind of making the game like scarier and more difficult for yourself for the rest of the game. And that is going to tie into like how this story concludes, and however we decide to finish it in the last chapter with, Micah Monroe's character confronting Dracula. And then, it'll lead to whatever the ending of the game, is.
I'm having a couple, I really like that idea, and a couple things that are coming to mind of like ways we could do that. One is like, I'm wondering if that's another place to bring invisibility or the invisible man in, like things
totally
like things are invisible that shouldn't be, or partially invisible. But I'm also thinking, I like the idea of using it for jump scares where what if like once you bring someone back, they are now periodically you'll be haunted by those who weren't brought back.
Sure,
because like you were supposed to be dead, and so like you'll be in the middle of something else and someone will appear and be like, you're supposed to be dead, or like a hand will reach through the ground and like drag you into the ground, like in Drag Me to Hell. Like it kind of like something's trying to drag you back, like, and it doesn't like interrupt the story, but like when you're in the middle of an unrelated thing, suddenly there's this jump scare of like, oh shit, there's a hand on my ankle, and like I'm okay, now I'm back.
Right.
Like, oh shit.
Yeah,
Another twist on that
flashback.
possibly is if we have the idea where we have characters that come back fine and we have characters come back fucked up. Like the main example being Henry Jekyll comes back with like a demon bound to his soul. So the idea being that the more times you resurrect, the greater likelihood is that you will lose control of your character.
But that could actually really tie in well with the inversion of the controls, where like you have some kind of demon that's making the mechanics harder for you. It's like confusing you or throwing you off.
So I think we have a really good like sort of canonical justification for this. And I just love when you have a game that offers you incomplete endings or like non-perfect things. It always frustrates me when people save scum that, because like you're reducing you're limiting one of the things that makes the game interesting. Like I've never gotten to Mass Effect 3 with Thane. I don't know what. Right. He always fucking dies, and when that happens, I'm like, that's a bummer. But I will play it again.
I think one thing that we solve for in this is like we get to have our cake and eat it too, in a sense, where like these stories can have like these kind of incomplete endings, or endings like nothing will feel incomplete. For like supermassive games never like feel incomplete at the end. They're always built with this in mind. But like, you can have stories where like, damn it, this like whole cast died, right? Or like whatever. But then we're still going to get like that tie off of the A plot story, right?
Yes, and it always works.
The Van Helsing.
But this is where you also have great opportunities. Like I like the way that when you started talking about this, I immediately started thinking of Remedial Chaos Theory, that really great season 3 community episode, where you get to explore what happens to this group of people in the same situation when one of them's missing. And I like the idea of when you have an ensemble, right, that you're working with. I think it's important in games to establish that there are relationships between the non-player characters and not just between each non-player character and the player character. So when you fail to save one of the non-player characters, it could affect the outlook or the eventual sort of ending that another character gets. Romances get broken or reestablished, or trust is damaged. And I understand I'm making this fucking really hard for the people designing this game, but I like that being a reason to replay and a reason for you to maybe let a character die because you want to know what happens if someone's missing. How does the outcome change?
Well, and this is why I chose Supermassive, because that is exactly what their games do. Like I just played Until Dawn and like I killed almost everybody, right? And it was a really interesting story because of it, right? It was like a really interesting like these character dynamics. Like there were these two characters that were like in love, right? And like one of them died, and how does that like affect it? And I think that'll just give them a lot of space to play with that exact thing, and making it hard for the dev. Like this is their thing, this is like what they excel at, and I think they can like really stretch their wings in like an actual all-in-one anthology game that messes with all of their like slasher horror tropes that they love and whatnot, that lets them like work with a bunch of like weird genre actors that they love to do, that plays with death in like a really impactful and interesting way, but that also pushes their ideas along a little bit further. It's not just, it's the same thing as how our games work, gives them a little bit to play with. I think they would love it. I think the whole team, I'll speak on behalf of them. They're going to love to make this.
Well, and we'll get to work on Dalton. If you're amenable, we'll get to work on slicing out a piece of our massive Universal Studios budget to start earmarking, and set a timetable for making the Dark Universe Omnibus.
I think so. I think we can give this the green light. I think now, should we call it the Dark Legion Omnibus or the Dark Universe?
Sorry, Dark
Omnibus?
Universe Omnibus.
You actually said Dark Legion.
I had said Legion, but I wasn't sure because I didn't know if you were using Dark Universe in your like marketing of. So
we have a bit
of the game
of confusing. We now kind of have two little brand names here, but I think actually Dark Universe Omnibus works better because not all of our Dark Legion characters are in this. Like Nick Morton isn't in this, and
neither of the Wolfmen are in it.
Wolf. And so this is more about the universe that's been created as opposed to the team of monsters that were established.
Totally.
So I think Dark Universe Omnibus works, and so I think.
And also, if we've done our job right, then Dark Universe becomes like an automatically have to go see every movie with this banner over it style, like Marvel. So
exactly.
The other thing I was going to say, I really love how the anthology aspect affects the replayability, because one of the things like when you're replaying a full like continuous story game, if you want to go back and see how Decision does, are you going to play the whole 20-hour game again?
No.
But in this version, because everything's kind of siloed, it's like, ooh, you know what? I really love the Mummy story, like I'm just going to replay that. And that's like a 2.5 hour replay to find the different endings of that chunk instead of needing to do the whole game.
And I think when you beat it, like you unlock the chapters menu, right? Where it's like, yeah, you can just go through and do all that separate from the A story. You don't have to do like the whole in between stuff. Like I think that's there, which is also in some of the Supermassive games. Like you can usually do that. Supermassive games also have a really cool thing. The Quarry has this mode called Director Mode, where you actually kind of like can watch it as a film. And what it happens is like at the beginning of it, you kind of like set stats for each character that you're going to deal with, where it's like, oh, I'm going to like, make them really good at reactions, but like kind of dumb or whatever. And you can just watch the game make the decisions for you and watch it as a film, which is really cool. Like a really innovative mode. Like
play this.
It's cool. I would recommend Until Dawn is like definitely, I think the better of the two, but like Quarry is like a classic slasher film. Justice Smith is in it. Grace Zabrisky's in it. Ted Raimi. Ted Raimi is that Tim's brother?
Ted Raimi,
and he's phenomenal in it. He's so much fun in it. And oh my God, what's his name? David Arquette is the like. David Arquette is kind of like the camp counselor at the head of this game.
Love that.
It's great. Quarry is really cool, and it's like all very like they're very big on performance capture, like visually, like really high end. Like because they don't have to worry about like a lot of like gameplay system stuff. They're really building these things that feel cinematic, camera shots and everything. They're just great like genre horror movies that are interactive.
This is great because we're getting to the end of the episode and it's like, oh, I really want to play this Dark Universe game. And a lot of times people get to the end of the episode, I really want to see this movie. And now it's like, well, I want to play this game, but I guess we can go play Until Dawn and The Quarry. So this whole episode has been a great advertisement for those games. You won't be able to play the Dark Universe Omnibus, unfortunately, but you can kind of get close.
We should ask Supermassive if they want to create like a promo code for us.
We should
sponsor the episode.
Try to get some affiliate links, some money from this.
I feel like that might be a conflict of interest for moi, but
that's true. That's true. Well, this is great.
Can't really do that one.
I think we are definitely going to greenlight the Dark Universe Omnibus coming soon to a console near you. Yeah, this is an excellent pitch. And now the Dark Universe has expanded beyond movies. We have a full-ass video game. So thank you, Giovanni, for expanding the Dark Universe a little bit larger.
Thank you for doing this. I love that you really took the spirit of what we've been doing on our show to heart in this pitch, and it's just very exciting and frankly very flattering. The amount of work you put into it.
Yes, we really appreciate it. That's where we don't know how much effort we can expect from every guest because people are busy and stuff, and that's understandable. But we really appreciate you going the extra mile and like really building out a full and complete and detailed pitch for us. Before we go, is there? Do you want to plug some stuff? What do you got going on? Tell people where to find you.
You can find me on Twitter at Mario Prime. You can read my writing about video games at digitaltrends.com. And you can listen to me talk about video games on my podcast, Left Trigger, Right Trigger, which is a very fun kind of video game book club style show where each episode we pick a topic and talk about 4 games that somehow relate to that topic.
It's great. And you have a Patreon for that, I believe.
We do have a Patreon, patreon.com/LTRT, I believe. You can go there for as little as $1 a month. You can support us and, you can get access to our Discord. We do side episodes that you can get exclusively through Patreon. And yeah.
Is there maybe a 24-hour live stream in the future?
Wow, when does this episode come out?
This will come out end of January.
Great. Hey, we're doing a 24-hour live stream. It's coming up. It's a charity stream that we do every year on twitch.tv/Left Trigger, Right Trigger. I believe the dates of it are going to be the 18th through 19th. I'm pretty sure 18th through 19th at the moment. If this episode has such a long tail that if anything changes before then, I will make you edit it and I'll record a new thing.
Also, just, follow Gio on Twitter and you'll get the updates. Yep. The live streams are really fun. They do a different video game every hour, and it's really fun to check in the wee hours of the morning and see how they've all gone insane.
The wee hours. Yeah, we only play Wii during certain hours.
There's an idea for this year.
Yeah, that's a great idea. No, we're going to be playing 24 of our favorite video games from 2022, one each hour, and we'll be raising money for a charity that will have been decided by the time this episode comes out, but that I don't have for you right now.
That's fine. Thank you so much. This was a total blast. I think this is the perfect addition to the Dark Universe. Thank you all for tuning in. Next week, we will be back with movie pitches, and I will finally be pitching the sequel to 2017's The Mummy called The Mummy Returns. And boy, do I have a lot to say about that movie and all mummy movies, having done a lot of research for writing this, but I think it's going to be really, really fun. And phase 2 will kick off officially. So thank you, Giovanni.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining the Dark Universe.
Being afraid of the Dark Universe.
Dark Universe.
Thanks for being afraid. Okay. Well,
thanks for being. See you next time, everybody.